After dipping the dies, what we're going to do next is we're going to trim off the excess wax from the dies so that we can fit the dies back in the model. And we have to do this very gently, just keep going over it so that eventually we'll cut through the wax. If we press the instrument too hard, it might crack the wax coping, and then we're going to have to dip again. Now this instrument is not a super sharp instrument because we're going to have to be careful with the die and not cut into it. If we use a very sharp instrument, we may even damage the margin. Now we can use some heat and we take away any of the very heavy parts or drips from the dipping process. This is a very flexible rubbery kind of wax, so that we don't want to leave too much of it on there. It should have a nice even layer all over the die and slightly past the margins. Now these are undipped dies, so that we can show how we actually put in just regular wax instead of dipping them. Now before we apply the wax, we need to obviously put in the die loop or die separator. This is made of a very thin oily substance that creates a layer so that the wax doesn't stick to the die. Without the die separator, we won't be able to remove the wax coping, so we'll have to steam it off and start again. Now when we start putting the wax on the die, we would need to heat the wax up slightly more than what we normally use for waxing, because we need the wax to flow evenly over the die surfaces. And we have to try to wax quickly so that the wax doesn't solidify before we put the next drop on. If the wax solidifies too much, we're going to end up with laminations or lines on the inside of the coping. And generally dentists don't like to see that. they like to see a nice smooth surface on the inside, so it doesn't get in their way of seating the die, seating the coping. You need to try to get that wax down to the margin. We need to add a little bit of wax to the corners of the die, because when we put the wax onto the die and it's slightly overheated, wherever you have corners or sharp edges, it's going to come out thinner, and in those thin areas we have to put a little bit extra wax. We want to make sure we don't put too much in the occlusion, because we need it for being able to put a more detailed anatomy onto the crown. When we put die separator onto the dies, we want to make sure that we don't put too much on, because if the die loop pulls in the occlusion or in the marginal areas, it's going to create voids when you place the wax on. It might even create little bubbles in the wax because your instrument is hot and then it hits a cold die loop and it creates bubbles, and thus incorporating that in the wax. As we noticed, the layer of wax is kind of thin because the wax itself is hot, so it runs over the surface nice and smooth. So if we see, the light areas are very thin, so in those areas we're going to need to apply the wax a little bit cooler so that the wax stays there. If the wax is heated too much, it's still going to run off those areas. Still have some thin areas, so we're going to have to add a little extra wax to it. So we have to control that heat. So now we have the wax coatings on. As we notice, we have a nice amount of space to work with, except for the central. The central doesn't have much, but we're going to have to work with that. Now in a real case, you would call the dentist and ask if he wants you to reduce the lingual of the central incisor, or he would like you to make maybe a metal lingual so that you can use the space that you have. Sometimes they will re-prepare and retake the impression for you. Sometimes they won't. So we're just taking off the areas that are a little too thick, with too much of that dipping wax on there. We don't want the entire coating consisting of dipping wax, because it's very malleable and it could distort. So we want something hard covering, like a shell of hard wax. So those areas are still thin, but we can just cover it as we are waxing the crowns. So we're going to do a full wax up on this so that we are able to see the entire contour of the bridge in its finished state. And after we do that, then we will take a matrix, a silicone matrix. So we're going to start the wax up now. We're going to start up with choosing a pontic that will best conform to your occlusion. We're going to start by building up the mesio-incisal point angle. By building up the mesio-incisal point angle, we'll be able to tell where the point angle of the central incisor will be. Next is the distal incisal point angle. Now be very careful how much you heat up the wax, because if we heat it up too much, it's going to run and we won't be able to build it up. So we have to kind of imagine the final shape of the tooth, and we'll build up that little piece of wax just where the distal incisal point angle would be. The next thing we're going to do is connect the two point angles. This will give us the incisal edge. So we will build it up to the adjacent central incisor. By allowing the wax to cool, we can adjust its placement. As we see, the incisal edge is almost the same as the adjacent tooth. By giving ourselves a lighter background, we can tell more easily where the incisal edge is. Next, we'll build up the mesial lobe, which is also the location of the mesiolabial line angle. Now we're moving on to the distal lobe, which is the location of the distal labial line angle. Now we're building up the cervical third, which is the location of the height of contour. As we move on to waxing, slowly we can adjust the mesial and distal line angles so we can shape them similarly to tooth number 9. Tooth number 9 is the adjacent central incisor. going to place the central lobe into its location. Now we have to be careful not to build it up too much, otherwise the tooth will look too rounded. Incisors in general are very flat. That's ideally. Some persons may have more rounded shapes, but ideally they are very flat teeth, and centrals are very wide. So as we see, once we place the lobe in there, in its location, it will start to create developmental grooves or developmental depressions in the case of anterior teeth. The developmental depressions are formed when the two lobes come together. So whenever two lobes come together, it forms one depression. So we have the central incisor, where the labial is comprised of three lobes. So we will have two developmental depressions on the facial surface. We also have to remember that they are not very distinct. They're not grooves, they're slight depressions, which creates a kind of shimmer on the surface of the finished crown. That's one of the telltale signs of a crown, is if the crown is made too smooth, it will not look natural. There should be multiple reflections on the surface of the tooth to help its natural appearance. As we see, we don't have much carving to do, because with the additive technique we add all the lobes on, we add all the anatomical structures on, so the need for carving will be greatly reduced. Mostly the teeth are not going to be perfectly symmetrical, because if you would make them perfectly symmetrical, it will also make it look like it's not a natural tooth. Now we're just going to strengthen the wax so it creates stronger bonds so that it doesn't break off with the underlying wax coping. And we're also adding contact point. When we have a wide contact point like that, we generally would want to remove some of it, because this looks more like a contact area, so Eventually, when we're finished with the crown, it should be more of a contact point. So now we're adding to the lingual part of the mesial lobe, which will also be the distolingual line angle, which is also the mesiolingual line angle, which is also the mesial marginal ridge. So now we're adding the distal lobe, the lingual portion of the distal lobe, or the distolingual line angle. And at the cervical area, we come to the cingulum. The cingulum is the bulkiest area of the lingual surface of the anterior teeth. So where the two marginal ridges meet, there may or may not be some little secondary anatomical grooves. Sometimes it's just a bulky surface. Sometimes it's two distinct ridges coming down, meeting at the cingulum and forming a groove right in between them. But this we have to decide by looking at the adjacent tooth, how it's formed, so that the patient feels like it's a similar kind of roughness on the crown as on the adjacent teeth. Since they are used to having the adjacent teeth in their mouth, we want to replicate those so it feels the same to the patient as before. So here we're just smoothing the lingual surface, kind of refining the anatomical structures and copying the structure of the adjacent central incisor. Here we're going to refine a little bit on the labial surface, refine the embrasures, refine the curvatures. There's always something to do. Here I felt that we're going to bring it out a little bit more. So we add a little more wax to the surface. Correcting the curvature a little bit. And we move on to the next tube. So if we notice that lateral incisor is pushed in and the central incisor is twisted out a little bit. So we're going to try to mimic that same tooth setup right there. So what we have to do when we build up the mesial point angle is build it up a little bit lingual to the central incisor to create that framework, so when we finish waxing the tooth it will automatically be twisted a little bit more to the lingual, so that the tooth will be situated like on the opposing side. Now again, you don't have to do it exactly the same way, just have a very similar setup. And what we're going to do now is measure how much shorter that lateral incisor is than the central. This will make it a little bit easier for us to figure out how long to make number 7. Number 7 is the right lateral incisor. So we measure the point angle, and we're going to try to make the point angle the same. Go ahead and do the incisal edge by joining the mesial and the distal point angles. Now we're working on the distal lobe. Then the mesial lobe. Remember to control that heat so that we can build it up and not wash it all out. move on to the gingival area or cervical area, and then we'll refine the mesial and the distal line angles, incisal edges. Central lobe. Refine the mesial line angle, making sure it's in the right place. You can see the developmental depressions there by the placement of the lobes separately. Notice the mesial point angle is in towards the lingual more and a little shorter, probably about 1 millimeter shorter or more than the central incisor. The distal is a little bit kicked out. Since that tooth is turned, we can't put the distal in towards the lingual more, because if we do, it's going to be too narrow. So the placement is important. Remember, when you twist something towards the mesiolingual, the distal buccal will be kicked out, and vice versa. So now it looks very similar. I decided not to wax it as far in as the other tooth, just do a little bit of a modification. Doing a little bit of a cleanup around the margins and making it a little bit narrower on the gingival area. This will give us a nicer gingival embrasure. Now you don't want to make an embrasure that's completely open. You just want to give enough of an embrasure so that when it's put in the mouth, the papilla just fills it up. If we don't give enough embrasure, then the papilla will be squeezed and it will be irritated when they put the teeth in. So here we're separating the teeth a little bit so they look little more separate by increasing the interproximal facial abrasion. The labial embrasures need to be there because if they're not deep enough, the teeth will not look separate. It will look like a big block of porcelain, even though they're separate teeth. When we're doing porcelain, we would be using a very, very thin diamond disc to go into the interproximals and with just the right embrasure space. Sure we have contact. Now some places may not have contact because the teeth are far in on the opposing arch like this one, so we may or may not be able to have contact on the tooth. So now we're just going to flex the lingual surface in a very similar way as we did with the central incisor. So we're building up contact right now. Once the contact is done, we will start waxing the rest of the tooth. Remember, the contacts do not need to be wide. Sometimes they may be wide because the incisors on the lower are very flat, so you can't have a point contact. But if you have enough space, then we could make the mesial and the distal marginal ridges into contact, and we would scoop out the central part of the lingual area so that we have point contacts on the marginal ridges only. now we're waxing the canine. So there was a little bit of a missing area there, so I waxed in the marginal areas, since there was an opening. On this tooth we want to start with the cusp tip. Since we don't have a flat incisal edge, the cusp tip is going to tell us exactly how high we make the tooth. Now we have to pay attention to make sure we don't put this cusp tip too far in or too far out. So we just have to look at the overbite and the overjet of the opposing side, or the right side. Actually it's on the left side because we're working on the right side, so when in doubt, look at the other side, see how it is. Now sometimes it may or may not be exactly the same depending on how the lower teeth are situated. So now we're waxing the slope of the mesiolabial cusp ridge. So the mesial cusp ridge generally goes from the mesio-incisal point angle to the cusp tip. So now we join the cusp tip to the mesio-incisal point angle, and that will form the mesial cusp ridge. So the point angle on the mesio of the canine is slightly lower than the distal point angle of the lateral incisor, even though the cusp tip is much higher, which is going to give a much steeper angle to the cusp ridge on the canine. So now we'll work on the distal lobe. Which then will become the distolabial line angle of the canine. Is the maxillary right canine, or tooth number 6. So once we got to the point angle on the distal, then we will join it to the cusp tip, which will form the distal cusp ridge. Now we have to remember that the distal lobe is generally tucked into the distal. We only observe the prominent central lobe and the mesial lobe. The distal lobe is only visible laterally. If we look at it from the front view, the distal lobe will be hidden behind the central lobe. The canine usually has the cusp tip a little bit to the mesial, so that will make the mesial cusp ridge a little bit shorter than the distal cusp ridge. Going to build up the height of contour and the central lobe. Now the canine is an anterior tooth, but the difference is that it is not flat. The central lobe of the canine is extremely prominent, which means it sticks out towards the labial. It also has more prominent developmental depressions because of that prominent lobe in the center. You notice if we are careful with the wax, it will create those developmental depressions for us. As we notice, now that we put in the central lobe, the distal lobe is no longer visible. working on the mesial lobe, the lingual area, which is the location of the lingual marginal ridge, mesiolingual marginal ridge. The canine has an extremely developed cingulum. It is the longest tooth in the mouth with the longest root. So this creates a very prominent cingulum, and it also creates a ridge that travels many times from the cingulum to the cusp tip. This tooth needs to be very strong because it is responsible for discluding the posterior teeth when we go into lateral excursions. This is what forms a mutually protected occlusion. Mutually protected occlusion is when the anterior teeth protect the posterior teeth from lateral forces, and the posterior teeth protect the anterior teeth from vertical forces. The anterior teeth are very good lateral force bearers because of their length of their root. The posteriors are very good bearers of vertical forces because of their multiple roots. If we notice on the left side, the canine has very prominent cingulum, and it has a ridge running from the cingulum to the cusp tip. We just have to make sure that there's occlusion on all of those teeth, but not very heavy occlusion. Sometimes anterior teeth are not even in contact because the posterior teeth are the ones bearing the lobe vertically. And anterior teeth sometimes come into contact only when you incise the food, which is like biting off things with your front teeth, or when you move into lateral excursions during chewing or during mastication. As we can see, everything is almost the same with some minor changes. You have to pay very close attention to the canines because it could throw things off when it's put in the mouth. So we're going to make it a tiny bit longer. Using a straight edge, we can more or less tell if we're in the right ballpark with the length of the canines as well as the centrals. The centrals should be about the same length as the canines, and then the laterals should be a little bit shorter. In this case, it's a lot shorter. Since we added a little bit to the incisal edge, we're going to have to smooth the wax in those areas. Now we have to make sure that we're moving right on the wear facets of the lower teeth. The lower teeth have areas of wear which are caused by the incisal edge of the original canine. So we have to make sure that that's exactly where our new canine will be placed. So it's going to slide on these wear areas, which are called wear facets. This will also let us confirm that the lateral motions are correct on the articulator, because we will see that the posterior teeth will be discluded in the right way.